Houston, we have a podcast. You're listening to the premier Rockets podcast. It's H-Town Hoops, hosted by Brandon Scott and Adam Spolane.
It is the H-Town Hoops podcast. I am Brandon Scott here with Adam Spolane, Austin Mendez producing this bad boy behind the scenes for us. And the last time that we talked, I think only one of the candidates had interviewed, if I'm not mistaken, Adam. I think we had only had Frank Vogel as the interview the last time we talked about a week ago. And since then, I can count them here between James Borrego, Kevin Young, and Adrian Griffin, Ime Udoka, and it looks like Sam Cassell, which is what we're going to get to now. Sam Cassell coming up. We got several more candidates that have interviewed and have been scheduled to interview. The latest being Sam Cassell, who's actually, as we record this, the Philadelphia 76ers are playing right now. Adam, we've touched on Sam Cassell as a candidate over the last couple of episodes that we've done, and now an interview has actually been scheduled. I want to make this point real quick and just kind of get your sense for how serious of a candidate you think Sam Cassell is. But I kind of feel bad for Sam Cassell because it feels like a lot of the attention, just in terms of talking point, I shouldn't say feel bad for because he doesn't care, but a lot of the talking points are either about his ties to the organization as a championship player and him being an assistant coach that's coaching James Harden right now. But he's also like an accomplished assistant coach, or at the very least, a guy who's been an assistant coach for a long time. And I was thinking about this. Jason Kidd is on his third job, is on his third NBA team. And Sam Cassell would just be now getting his first if he were to get this job. I think that Sam Cassell, even if he were to put aside the fact that he's tied to that he was on those championship teams with the Rockets, put aside the fact that he has some sort of working relationship with James Harden already, and that there is a connection there with James Harden and the pursuit there. Sam Cassell himself just seems like to be a very interesting candidate in terms of assistant coaches for this job. What do you think are his actual chances here?
It's hard to know what his chances are, but I think the point that you made, I think the stuff about Harden is a moot point, to be honest with you, because this is a guy who has been interviewing for other jobs throughout the league. And he also interviewed for the Rockets job the last time around. And that was when he wasn't, coaching James Harden. So I think that part of it is moot at this point. I think he obviously is getting interviewed. I do think part of it is the connection to the organization. I do think that matters, but I think just his overall resume is why he gets a chance to interview for the job. And it's why he's interviewed for other jobs in the past, including the Rockets a couple of years ago, because it's a very strong resume. And when you have spent as much time in the league as he has, I mean, he's been in the league since 1993. It's been 30 years since he's been in the league. He's basically been in the league nonstop as a player, as an assistant coach. That earns you some respect, and you should have some respect for what he's accomplished in the league. He's been an assistant coach with Washington. He's been an assistant now under Doc Rivers for almost a decade in two different stops. So he is qualified of all the assistants that are going to have interviews for jobs, both for this job, for the Detroit job, and for any other job that might open up over the next week or so. He is just as qualified as any of them. So I don't know if he has a real chance to get this job, just because there are other really strong candidates that they are interviewing as well. But the fact that he's getting an interview, I do think that it matters. The fact that he interviewed with them the last time and they thought enough of him to bring him back, I do think that matters.
Yeah, man. And I think that who he's worked under, it matters as well. Like the fact that, like the actual type of experience that he's had and working under Doc over these last few years, I think that's going to be, I just think that's valuable experience for him, and sort of a feather in his cap. Ime Udoka interviewed on Wednesday, I believe it was, interviewed with the Rockets on Wednesday. This is one of the names, if not the name, that we talked about that's the biggest lightning rod, I would say, because there's so much potential there with him as a coach, but also such a big question mark and such an unknown from how he departed his last place and all of that. I guess it's an encouraging sign that he's at least interviewing for the job, or that there is some interest there. Because it feels like if it was bad enough to where it was bad enough that it wouldn't warrant interest. Like teams wouldn't even be wanting to talk to this guy. it just feels like such a mystery, and I don't really know what to make of it. We mentioned that in the last episode, but Ime Udoka interviewing, or I should say, now that he has interviewed, he does feel like, outside of, say, Frank Vogel, who's won a championship, and I would say even with him included, he feels like the strongest candidate so far that's interviewed.
Well, if you take the baggage away, he's number one on the list. And I don't think there's any question that he's number one on the list because of what he did last year in Boston. And to take that Boston team, and they got off to just a dreadful start, and it looked like they were in serious trouble. And they're talking about maybe having to split up the Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. And then to get that thing together and play as well as they did the entirety of the second half of the season, through the postseason, into the finals, he's clearly number one on the list. However, it's a big however, and that is there's a reason why he's available. And that is that the Celtics, whatever he did, and we don't know what he did, but in America, the land of second chances, the Celtics said, no, we're not even messing with the second chance. They know more about what Ime Udoka did than I do, and that they didn't think he was worthy of getting a second chance. So we talked about this last week. If he were to get the job, and I still think the chances of it are pretty remote at this stage, but if he were to get the job, he's going, the press conference is going to be, well, why did you get fired? Why are you even in this position in the first place? And they can't dance around it. They've got to be forthcoming. They've got to explain, hey, this is what happened in Boston, and this is what's not going to happen again. And then the other question that you asked to the Rockets is, this is, like I just said, the Celtics did not feel he was worth getting a second chance. The Celtics had an opportunity to just suspend him, bring him back. They said no. Does that concern you at all that the Celtics, who know more about the situation than anyone, they had an opportunity to give him a second chance and they just washed their hands of it?
Yeah, well, I want to go back to what you said a moment ago, that you said the chances are remote. Why do you think that is? Since they interviewed him and he's available, and you figure if they get the answers, let's say they get the answers to these questions privately before they address us in the public, right? Let's say they get the answers that they like, or answers that they find to be acceptable. It feels like almost like a depreciated asset, a guy who shouldn't even be available in the first place. If he gives you answers that you like, it seems like it would almost be a no-brainer. The only way I'd see it otherwise is if there was somebody else that they liked a little bit more. Maybe if they disagreed with you a little bit and saw Frank Vogel as the best candidate, or one of these other guys for whatever reason. But to me, it seems like if the answers to the next questions are acceptable to them, then they would do that. You don't think so?
I just, from what I heard at the start of the process, it kind of seemed like he was one of the unlikely guys. We listed all the guys that they were going to talk about. He was one. Kenny Atkinson, who they've requested to interview, and he has yet to interview. He was another guy on that list, and it felt like those two were kind of remote when this whole process started. So the fact that they did interview Udoka, I do think that matters, and maybe that changes the equation a little bit. And I guess it made them feel at least comfortable enough with what they have found, might have gone down in Boston. Maybe they are comfortable with that. But I just feels like, to me, the chances seem slim. I could wind up being completely wrong, and in a couple of weeks we could be talking about Rockets head coach Ime Udoka. But that's just the feeling that I have about it right now. And do you want to deal with the sideshow that's going to come with it? I think that for me is the number one question, where, that whole introductory press conference is supposed to be kind of a celebration of the guy that you're bringing in as your head coach. And instead, I feel like it's going to wind up turning into a defense of the decision that you made. And instead of talking about basketball, we're talking about stuff that happened in Boston.
I'm going to come back to another Udoka related question in a second. But since you mentioned Kenny Atkinson, tell me, do you think it's weird at all that, or does it show almost a lack of interest? Like the reasoning that I read for Kenny Atkinson not scheduling an interview is because they're still in the playoffs, because of the playoff schedule with the Warriors, which there could be something to that. But I'm sitting up here watching the Sixers play right now with Sam Cassell on the bench with them. So, like, am I reading too much? Obviously, I do not know. But is there anything to read into that this job has been out there for well over a week now, and Kenny Atkinson was an early name that was of interest to the Rockets, and they still haven't scheduled an interview?
Oh, I mean, he was one of the first guys they requested an interview with. So yeah,
Right.
I do find it interesting that he has not given or that he has not scheduled, or he might have scheduled one and we just don't know it. But that was one of the things that we talked about at the beginning of this process. It felt like he was kind of a remote possibility because he wanted to stay in Golden State. He wanted to stay with the Warriors. He had an opportunity to get a head coach job. He was hired by the Hornets last year, and then he backed out after the finals. And a lot of it is that his family seems to be really happy in the Bay Area, and you never know what's going to happen with Steve Kerr. And it feels like Steve Kerr might not be long for that job. He might just be tired of it, and if Steve Kerr were to step away from that job, then it's a very simple, he just slides, Atkinson just slides over the one seat, he takes over there. So, that's why to me, it kind of felt like he was not, somebody that if he were to be interested in the Rockets, I think that the Rockets would love to hire him, but I just don't know how interested he would be in leaving Golden State. It kind of felt like he might go to Atlanta until they hired Quinn Snyder. It kind of felt like for him is either the Warriors, just stay there, or go to Atlanta.
All right, back to Ime Udoka real quick. And look, he coached the guy for 1 year, but there's the Jaylen Brown chatter out there. I know that you've heard the Jaylen Brown interest. And look, if he's unhappy, if he wants to be traded from Boston, like the rumors are out there, then any team that is looking to upgrade its roster and looking to add talent should be interested in Jaylen Brown on some level, I feel like. And the Rockets will be included in that. Do you see this? I don't think that they're necessarily related. I think it's more of a coincidence than anything. But do you see this as a possible happy coincidence that if the Rockets somehow, again, feel good about and satisfied with whatever answers they get to the very meaningful and relevant questions with Ime Udoka, and if they would be willing to go down that route and also be willing to trade for Jaylen Brown, do you sense that there could be a serious sense of interest there, and who knows, long shot pairing of these two guys, or I should say reuniting of these two guys in Houston?
We talked about the Jaylen Brown possibility back in December, and just kind of understanding that he would be the exact perfect fit for what they need. When you look at the defense, he doesn't necessarily need the ball to succeed, got the size, he's absolutely perfect for them. So certainly if he were to come available, whether via the trade market or free agency next summer, then yeah, I think the Rockets would 100% be interested. But I also think, man, if you are hiring a head coach with the hopes that he can recruit somebody else to your team, that gets real dangerous. Because remember, if Jaylen Brown makes All NBA, then the Celtics can offer him a supermax, and anything the Rockets offer gets completely blown out the water. And so now you're you're left with Ime Udoka, and it's very, very unlikely that Jaylen Brown were to take less money in order to he would take less money to sign with the Rockets and rejoin his head coach. He's going to take the money over rejoining his old head coach, and at least he should. I mean, you do that.
Oh yeah,
you do that sure. 99 times out of 100. So that's why I always think it's dangerous. If your plan is to hire somebody for the simple hope of recruiting somebody else, that usually doesn't work out. How many times can you point to where that has actually worked, where that has worked out the way that you wanted it to work out?
Yeah, I guess that's why I framed it more so as a happy accident, because that's what it would really be. Because paint out your scenario, or just play it out. If you don't get Jaylen Brown, you at least do still have Ime Udoka, independent of whatever free agent might come or be interested in playing under him. He himself is a good head coach. Again, if you feel okay and feel good about the other things and the other questions that need to be asked and answered, then whether you get Jaylen Brown or not, at the very least, you would have what you could argue, and what you just did argue a few moments ago, is the best available head coaching candidate out there on the market. So I think it would be. I'm really intrigued by him. I think that he is, let's just say an incredible two-way player. What he gives you on both ends of the floor. And he even gives you some level of shooting. Think about it like that too. They have no shooting on this team. I mean, he he would address in some form or fashion, in some way, can play a lot better of a playmaker than he was when he got in the league. Like he can do a little bit of all of the things that the Rockets are lacking. And so yeah, I think that he also would be a perfect fit. I do wonder how much there is to the rumors in Boston and what his actual interest would be in Houston. Like if he would kind of be in, does he look at what Houston is building and would he feel inclined to be a part of it? Does he see himself like having a role as a part of what the Rockets are building? I don't know how much he's looked into it, but I don't know. It's just an interesting thought to me.
Yeah, he would be if he were a free agent this summer. He's the first call that they're making. They call him before they call James Harden. At least they should. They should call him because just how good he is. He's still really young. Like he's a perfect fit. Brings some experience. He's a guy who's been in winning situations now essentially his entire career. I mean they have not missed the playoffs since he got to Boston. He's been to the Eastern Conference Finals multiple times. He was in the NBA Finals last year. I mean that's the guy that you want. That's the guy that you really want to be able to build around. Unfortunately, I think the timeline doesn't really match up. Now the question becomes, if he were to become a free agent, or not a free, if he went to the Celtics and said, "Hey, I'm not coming back here, trade me," that becomes a discussion, and it becomes a discussion of, okay, if you're the Rockets, what would you be willing to give up in order to get him? And obviously, you have your first round pick this year that I do think is something that teams would be interested, even if it falls out of the top three. I think the Rockets would probably look to trade that first round pick if it falls out of the top three. But then you start going down the list, and are there guys on the roster that you would feel comfortable trading in order to get Jaylen Brown? And not just guys on the roster, but also draft picks that you would be willing to trade in order to get Jaylen Brown. And the Rockets are under the cap, so you wouldn't have to make the contract add up. But would you be willing to trade, let's say, the number 4 pick in this year's draft, plus Jabari Smith Jr., plus another piece here, another piece there? Would you be willing to go that route in order to get Jaylen Brown with the hopes that he would re-sign with you in the offseason? And it becomes a very interesting question because you could trade for Jaylen Brown, but you would not be able to sign him to an extension because of just the way the cap rules work, where you wouldn't be able to offer him that max extension. So you'd be taking a pretty big risk. So that's why I would be shocked if anything like that were to happen. But when he does become a free agent next summer, I still think the Rockets will absolutely look into that and try to make that work because he's that good a player. And if Ime Udoka is the head coach, does that help make it happen? Maybe. But also if the Rockets show significant improvement next year, maybe that could be what makes it happen as well under a head coach Frank Vogel or James Borrego or Sam Cassell or whoever else.
So it sounds like to me, though, it probably wouldn't be worth the risk to trade for him if he's going to become a free agent anyway, and you yourself are, let's say, a year from now, like you just said, are a more desirable free agent destination based off of how you've kind of gotten your stuff together over the last year.
And I don't think Boston would do it either because regardless of what happens the rest of this season, they are going to contend for a championship next year. Like that roster, they're bringing back that entire roster, so they'll be able to contend. And they could just say, hey, you know what, we get it. You don't want to come back here after the 2024 season, but you know what, give us one last ride. Let's try to win this championship, one last chance, and then we'll part ways once this season ends.
All right. Well, speaking of potential free agents and contending rosters, James Harden is on one right now. He's a potential free agent after this year, of course. I don't know if you heard, and we talked about it, of course, but he's on a roster right now that has a legitimate chance to at least go to the Eastern Conference Finals. I mean, I think they're just as talented as most teams in the Eastern Conference, any other team in the Eastern Conference. I don't really understand this, man. Like, I'm trying to get it. Like, I get that Harden loves Houston. I get that there is this connection between Harden and the organization that is like undeniable. I understand that. But like you would think a guy would be interested in being on a winning team and being attached to a winning player like Joel Embiid, who very well probably win the MVP this year. Like, I'm trying to understand James Harden's motivations, and I can't get into the man's head, but I was listening, or I guess I came across it on Twitter of Adrian Wojnarowski on his podcast with ESPN mentioning that the Houston is very much in play with James Harden, and that his future there is very uncertain there in Philly, and it's like this is a headline and everything. It's like, we've been talking about this for almost the entire season. Nothing. It didn't feel like anything new had been said. Or did Harden just get ejected as we're literally as we're talking about him?
He gave Royce O'Neal an elbow or a forearm to the groin. So yeah, he has.
They were pushing and shoving earlier. They had been physical the entire game. I obviously turned my head to come record this, but that doesn't surprise me actually, because they had been mixing it up already. But yeah, made me lose my train of thought. But basically, Harden's motivations. I don't understand why you would want to leave Joel Embiid and the opportunity to compete in the East every year just to come back and hang out in Houston.
I mean, sometimes winning, I'm not going to say winning isn't most important, but just being happy is most important, is more important than anything. And that's why you hear people say all the time, well, why wouldn't you want to get traded at the deadline to Team X? A lot of times it's because I don't want to get traded. I don't want to uproot my life to go try and be the savior of this team, because when you get traded at the deadline, then you are automatically you're pinned as the savior and you're the one who's supposed to get us over the top. That's not a fun situation necessarily to be in. So for Harden, we've talked about how he I think he does want to get back here. I think he misses being in this part of the country. I think he just misses, the city and all the stuff that comes with it. And I think there's probably some other personal reasons that come with it as well. But I do think there's a financial aspect also, where if the Sixers pay him, if the Sixers give him what he wants, then he would probably stay there. If they don't, then he'll just come back here. So I'm always, I don't know the motivation. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know why he would want to leave, the team, the third best team in the Eastern Conference, where they're going to be in the second round. They will be locked in a very tough series, in the East semifinals. Why he would want to leave that for a team that has not made the playoffs, basically been the worst team in the league for the last 3 years. Part of it, I do think, is just kind of the emotional attachment to the city and the organization. I do think that sort of stuff matters, Damian Lillard could have asked out of Portland many, 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 many times over the last few years. That team's not winning anything when he's there, but he wants to stay there because that's where he feels most comfortable. That's where he's happy. And I do think that there's something to that. The culture that we're in right now is where it's basically a culture of, if you don't win, you're a loser. And I don't think that was always the case. You used to see guys stick with the same team their entire career. Hakeem Olajuwon was with the Rockets for almost his entire career. They did not compete for championships that entire time. I think the best example of it is Utah, where you had John Stockton and Karl Malone. It took them, 15 years, almost 15 years before they even made the finals. And yet they stuck with it. They stuck together, with that organization, essentially their entire careers until Stockton retired. And then Malone went off to LA right after that. I mean, think of how many times, when they lost early in the playoffs in like the late 80s and early 90s, when it's like 7 straight years of coming up short in the Western Conference playoffs. If that were today, and we just saw it in Utah with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, if that happens today, one of those two, maybe both, get traded at some point and they break that team up. So we've kind of gotten into this thing where, well, if you're not winning a championship, then you're completely worthless and your career is worthless and you should just, you should be looking to do something else. But I do think that happiness matters, and being in a place where you're happy, I think that sort of stuff matters to people. At least it should. So if he feels like he is happier playing in Houston, playing in an organization that he really likes, and being in a city that he really likes, then hell, let him do it. I got no problem with that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You kind of assume. I think we try to apply our own sensibilities of competitiveness without actually being the competitor. Like, you try to just imagine. I think a lot of fans try to just imagine, or how would I look, or how does this best fit the narratives that we've constructed over time of what a winner is, or what a legend's resume should look like by the time that they've retired, and what should be their motivations. But the truth is, I think there's a lot to what you say. There's like the motivations might actually be happiness, and happiness could very well conflict with the narratives that we've constructed or the ideas that we've decided are right, like pursuing ring chasing or pursuing a championship, and so I think that that's interesting, and just from a sports standpoint to think of, hey, somebody might be happier playing at a place where they're less competitive. I think, again, is an aversion to the sports fandom sensibility a little bit. Like, hey, you're supposed to be competitive, you're supposed to be trying to win, but we got to keep in mind that these are human beings, that these are people. So so there's definitely something to that. As far as like from the Rockets side though, and with Harden, I do think, because I mean I listen to whenever there's a conversation about James Harden, I'm always like locally, I'm always interested to see how people approach it and how people kind of couch it. And so many are like, oh, there's no way you could bring somebody in like that. He'd ruin your locker room, he'd ruin your team culture, and all of these other things that I'm like, guys, the team cut like James Harden gets here. I'm not saying that they should do it or don't, but he gets here, he ain't making it worse. I don't think he's getting here and making it worse. And I don't think it gets there's enough credit given to, and I do understand why people think that, right? Because James Harden's got the party boy reputation and all of that. But I don't think he gets enough credit for the way he changed his game and adjusted his game after he left Houston. From the days in Brooklyn to the days now in Philly, like he's a completely different player. When he's healthy, he's a completely different type of player than the one that I think Rockets fans remember when he was here. And if you're following the league, you know that. But the type of player that he is now does coincide or mesh with the type of player that they exactly need. Now obviously they need more on defense as well, and maybe that'll come. A lot of that will come with coaching, and James Harden certainly isn't that. But yeah, man, it's fascinating that the sort of the emotional reaction does not jive with the logical basketball rationale of why to bring him here. You know what I mean? Like he actually makes sense and fits on your roster if you separate sort of the history from it all.
Yeah, he's a point guard. He's a walking one man elite offense, and that essentially is been that's what he's been his entire career, especially since he joined the Rockets in 2012. Like he is a one man show on that end of the floor. If you have him on the floor, you are going to have a great offense. That's just how it is. And the Rockets offense has been, let's be honest, horrific the last 3 years. So just adding him right there, it makes you better. Even though he's not the James Harden of 2018, you don't need him to be the James Harden of 2018. You're not looking to win a championship next year. You're just looking to be respectable because they haven't been that. Adding James Harden to the roster makes you respectable. It just does. And so he's not going to play every night. This isn't going to be him playing 82 games, and playing the second night of a back-to-back all the time. And, it's going to be different than what it was if he were to come back, but he's still really, really good. And he understands the game probably better than anyone else. And we talk about coaching, and we talk about, well, Vogel's a defensive coach. They need an offensive coach, to go with him. Well, James Harden probably sees the game better than any offensive coach you could ever imagine having on your staff. So, he would make you better in so many different ways. And, just having somebody who knows what they're doing on the floor most of the time would be nice, because this team has been lacking that. And you know what? Say what you want. Everywhere the guy goes, they win. And you look back at, in Oklahoma City, he's never missed the playoffs. He's been in the league now for 12, 13, 14 years. He has never missed the playoffs during that stretch. And we're talking, he's in the Western Conference for 8 years. They finished top 4 in the West. 6 out of the 8 years. I mean, that's hard to do during that stretch from 2013 through 2020. The Rockets were a top 4 team in the West 6 out of 8 years. That's hard. That doesn't happen very often. They won playoff series. They got out of the first round of the playoffs 5 times in 8 years, in an 8-year stretch. That's not something that had been done here in a long, long time since Hakeem Olajuwon was around. So, little things like that. He's not perfect. He's older. He's not as durable as he once was, but he can still really play, and he gives you a chance to win whenever he's on the floor. And that's what they need to get to. They're not looking to go from 22 wins to winning a championship next year. They're looking to take the next step after that, take the next step after that. And that's how you get to a championship level. It's not going to happen overnight.
Jaylen Green was on IG Live, and I didn't see the whole thing, but there's a clip out there of him saying that, we're going to the playoffs next year. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to do, coming in hot, all of that. And I just think about, and kids being kids on IG Live. But aside from that, I just think about how much smarter and better of a basketball player could Jaylen Green become being around James Harden and playing with James Harden every day.
Just being with him on the practice floor every day.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean.
Yeah, and watching film with him every day. That sort of stuff matters. And you know what? This time last year, there was nobody in that building talking about playoffs. No one. Even going to the offseason, going to training camp. Nobody was talking about, hey, we could be in the playoffs. We could be in the play. No, they all knew what this was going to be. But now the expectations are different, and they're going to go into camp with expectations of actually winning some games. And so they're going to add to the roster. They're going to add, in all likelihood, a top 5, top 6 pick. Maybe they trade the pick or whatever. They're going to add veterans. They're going to add more than one veteran. The roster was very thin. I don't think people understand just how thin the roster really was, because we saw all these names of guys that they had drafted, but they weren't good NBA players. The talent level on the roster is going to improve significantly. And one of the things that we'll get into as we get to the offseason is that you have some guys that are kind of, on the roster right now that might not be on the roster by the time next season starts. And so your talent level 1 through 15 should be maybe not 1 through 15, but 1 through 9, which is really what matters. It's going to be better next year. And so, we'll have to see what happens. The West is going to be a gauntlet, as it always is. It's going to be tough to compete, but they're going to at least try, and they're going to take their swings, and the expectations will be totally different.
Sometime soon in the offseason, Adam, I think we should do maybe a free agent wish list, or something to that effect, something adjacent to that. And also the point that you just made about players not on the team, maybe even discuss scenarios in which a said player might not be on the team, and start maybe looking ahead at that. Like what different moves could they make to change the makeup of this roster? I think those are interesting thought exercises that you and I can do as we move forward, man. What have you thought, before we get out of here, man? What have you thought of the first few games of the first round of the playoffs so far, man? It was interesting to me that first night. Was it Saturday when all but one of the road teams won, and then the next day it was the opposite? It's been, for the most part, a really interesting first round. I'm really intrigued by this Suns and Clippers series, and that game is going to start, it looks like, any moment on NBA TV. So I'm actually not exactly sure. Oh, I've got League Pass. I should be able to find it somehow. But Kawhi's not playing in that game. Injuries have really been an issue for me in this. Has been kind of the only sour spot so far of the first round. And then, of course, this whole Draymond Green, Domantas Sabonis situation was also a little bit of a kind of a sidebar as well. But what have been some of your first round takeaways so far?
I think just how much more intense these games are compared to regular season games.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And it's a little bit of a problem for the league that it just looks so much different, and the quality of play is really just so much better. And, these games actually matter, whereas, most of your regular season games could not matter less. So that's been fun. Also, I think the other thing that you notice is just bad players get exposed so easily when you get into these games. And I'm not, I'm saying, if you're a bad defender, you're going to get exposed. If you are a weak offensive player, you are going to get exposed. And it's really hard, if you are not a two-way player, to survive in the NBA playoffs.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'm just looking at a couple of the series, man. Sacramento is one that, of course, we saw them up close because, they obviously played the Rockets a lot, being in the Western Conference. But I think a couple of times, did they play them back to back both times that they played them? Yeah. Okay, so that's why Sacramento is so pronounced in my mind. I'm like, man, I feel like I saw Sacramento play 1,000 times, but it's because the times I watched them most closely were times that I watched them in back-to-back games. But I'm curious from you, man. Do you think, and they're gonna play by the time this pod, maybe I should even ask this question because by the time this podcast is out, people will know the answer. But I feel like the Warriors are in some serious trouble, man. Like I won't ask you if you think they can sweep them because by the time we publish this, the answer to that question will be out there. But this looks like the Kings in a rout to me. I don't know. What do you think?
I don't want to make too much of the first two games just because of how different the Warriors have been at home compared to on the road. It's just been the most bizarre thing in the world where they won 11 games. They were 11-30, I think, on the road
Yeah.
this season, and they're completely different once they get to Chase Center. So I'm gonna hold off. I don't think that Sacramento will sweep. I just think that you get that group, they got way too much pride to get swept, and it's hard for me to think that you're just going to shut down Steph Curry, in San Francisco for those two games, even without Draymond Green. But they're going to have to be, especially for Game 3, they're going to have to get creative on how they're going to defend, because I think the one thing that has really stood out, and I think is the one thing that kind of worried you about Sacramento, and it's a big reason why the Warriors were favored in this series, was I think people thought that Sacramento's offense wouldn't necessarily translate to the playoffs, and it has. And they have essentially done whatever they have wanted at the offensive end of the floor. And De'Aaron Fox is just blowing by everybody. He's had very little resistance on the offensive end. Sabonis struggled in the first game, but he got it together, I think, in game 2. So just the Kings offense carrying over into the playoffs, I think, has probably been, one of the bigger surprises to me. I know they were great, all regular season. They were best offense in the league, but it kind of felt like it was a regular season offense because it's not a great 3-point shooting team. You have their two best offensive players. Sabonis is a big who doesn't really shoot threes, and then you have Fox, who's kind of a little guard. Those guys don't necessarily thrive once you get into postseason, but
he's a killer though, man. He is a killer. That you talk about a competitor, man. That dude's got a gear to him, got an extra gear to him. It seems like.
Yeah, it's been impressive, and that team has a little bit more depth than I think that people realized, or at least gave them credit for. You're seeing guys like Alex Len has been in the league for 10 years, and he's showing up and putting up really good games against the defending champions. So I think the Kings' depth and just the offense carrying over into the postseason has been most impressive to me.
I didn't think the Lakers had nearly as much of a chance as I feel like they do now.
His best player gets hurt.
Yeah. Well, right, exactly. But man, they got like some of their other players have stepped. Like the biggest issue with the Lakers is that they had nothing around, like not enough around LeBron James and Anthony Davis. But now that doesn't feel like the case. I mean, the Grizzlies are in trouble, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe I was just underselling the Lakers a little bit, like overall.
Yeah, what they did last night was impressive, though. To hold the Lakers under 100 points, they kind of got back to their identity, where that was it was them in Cleveland. I think were the two top defenses in the league, so they kind of got. That's one of the things with Morant. Morant obviously is incredible; he's a great player, but when he's off the floor, defensively they're a different team, and so he was a lot better there. They controlled the glass a lot more. They were a little bit more physical with Anthony Davis, and that's what they have to do in order to survive in that series. So I thought that them winning that game, I don't know if Morant's going to play in game 3. I think they got a couple days. He's got a little bit of he's got a little that series is they have the 2 days in between games 1 and games in game 2. So
right.
He's got a little while, but I think Memphis might have found their footing in that series.
All right, man. That's Adam Lane. I'm Brandon Scott. Austin Mendez is handling this thing, producing it. Of course, like we talked about, man, a lot to go over with this Rockets all season, this pursuit for a new head coach. There will be interviews, as we discussed earlier. Sam Cassell interviewing on Sunday with the Rockets, former Rockets point guard and champion Sam Cassell, long-term assistant coach. So we will continue to monitor how this thing goes, bring you weekly analysis and thoughts on the Rockets all season. And until next time, all of y'all, be good.